The first time they heard him play, the room did not feel the same again. The air itself seemed to change, heavy, uneasy, as if something invisible had entered and refused to leave. And in the corner of that grand room stood a small boy, blind, quiet, his fingers resting on the piano keys, waiting while the men who believed they owned him sat watching, unaware that what they were about to hear would disturb them in ways they could not explain. Welcome to Story of the Black Past, where we bring you hidden stories from history that many have never heard before. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching this. And if you have not subscribed yet, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support means everything. Thank you for being here. Stay until the end, because this story will take turns you do not expect. Now relax, avoid all distractions, and pay close attention as we begin. His name was Thomas Wiggins, born into slavery in the American South in the year 1849. He entered a world where he was not expected to be anything more than labor, but from a very early age, something about him was different, something that no one around him could fully understand. He could hear things in ways others could not, remember sounds after hearing them once, and recreate them perfectly, as if his mind was holding on to something far beyond what people believed possible. The plantation where he lived belonged to a man who quickly noticed this strange ability. At first it seemed like nothing more than curiosity, a child making sounds, repeating voices, imitating noises, but then something changed, something that made the people around him stop and pay attention. Because when Thomas was placed near a piano for the first time, he did not just touch it, he understood it. It began quietly, a few notes, simple sounds, but then those notes turned into patterns, and those patterns turned into full melodies, complex and layered, far beyond what anyone expected from a child who had never been taught. And the more he played, the more people gathered, drawn by something they could not explain, something that felt both beautiful and unsettling at the same time. The men who owned the plantation saw opportunity, not humanity. They saw a way to profit, a way to turn this boy into something that could entertain, impress, and bring attention. And so Thomas was pushed further, made to play for guests, for visitors, for people who came not to understand him, but to witness something unusual, something that made them feel both amazed and uncomfortable. But there was something else happening, something that could not be easily explained or controlled, because as Thomas played more often, some of those who listened began to feel strange, not physically harmed, but unsettled, restless, as if the music was reaching into places they did not want to confront. And though they laughed it off, joked about it, dismissed it, the feeling remained. They began to say things in quiet voices, not loud enough to be taken seriously, but enough to spread that the boy's music was not normal, that it carried something inside it, something heavy, something that lingered long after the last note was played. And though no one dared to call it dangerous, no one could deny that it had an effect. Thomas himself did not speak much. He lived in a world shaped by sound, by memory, by patterns that only he seemed to fully understand. And when he played, it was as if he was telling a story without words, a story filled with emotion, tension, and something deeper, something that those who listened could feel but could not fully explain. As the years passed, his performances grew more intense, more complex, more overwhelming, and the audiences grew larger. People traveled to see him, to hear him, to witness what they called genius. But beneath that admiration was something else, something they did not want to admit, a quiet discomfort that followed them even after they left. Some would lie awake at night after hearing him play, unable to shake the feeling that something in that music had reached them, had touched something inside them that they had tried to ignore. And though they returned to their lives, to their power, to their control, the memory of that sound stayed with them. And on the plantation, where Thomas continued to live under control, under watch, under ownership, the People who saw him every day began to notice something even more unsettling, because the more he played, the more it felt like he was not just repeating what he heard. He was expressing something, something personal, something deep, something that could not be easily explained. The masters still saw him as property, still believed they controlled him, but they did not understand that what lived inside his music could not be owned, could not be fully controlled, and as his fingers moved across the keys, creating sounds that filled the air and settled into the minds of those who listened, a quiet question began to grow. What exactly was hidden inside that music, and why did it feel like more than just sound? The nights on the plantation began to change in ways that were difficult to explain, because what started as simple entertainment slowly turned into something heavier, something that lingered in the minds of those who listened, and even when the piano was silent, the echoes of those sounds seemed to remain, as if the music had settled into the walls, into the air, into the thoughts of everyone who had heard it. The men who owned Thomas did not notice it at first, or perhaps they refused to see it, because to them he was valuable, not as a person, but as something rare, something they could show to others, something that brought attention and money. And so they pushed him harder, made him play longer, made him perform for more people, never stopping to wonder what constant pressure was doing to a boy whose mind already carried more than most could understand. But the others on the plantation noticed. They always noticed because they lived closer to the truth of things. They saw the small changes, the way Thomas would sit quietly before playing, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear, the way his fingers would hesitate for just a moment before touching the keys, as if he was deciding what story to tell that day. And when he played, it was no longer just music, it was something deeper, something that felt like it carried emotions that had no words, pain that had no voice, and those who listened carefully, those who allowed themselves to feel it, began to understand that this was not just talent, this was expression, this was something real, something that came from a place far beyond simple skill. There were moments when the room would grow so quiet that even breathing felt loud, moments when the music slowed, softened, became almost fragile, and in those moments something inside the listeners would shift, something uncomfortable, something they did not want to face because it reminded them, in ways they could not fully explain, of things they preferred to ignore. Then, without warning, the music would change, rising suddenly, becoming louder, sharper, more intense, like a storm breaking through calm skies, and the shift would be so sudden, so powerful, that it would make people sit up, their hearts racing, their minds struggling to keep up with what they were hearing, because it felt like the music was not just being played, it was happening to them. Some laughed it off after, calling it impressive, calling it strange but not dangerous, but their laughter did not reach their eyes, because deep down, something had unsettled them, something had made them feel exposed, as if the music had seen through them, had understood something about them that they themselves did not want to face. Rumors began to move quietly, carried in whispers, never spoken loudly, never confirmed, but never completely denied, that there was something unusual about the boy, that his music did more than entertain, that it reached into people in ways that could not be easily explained, and though no one could point to harm, no one could deny the effect. Thomas himself remained quiet, unchanged on the surface, but inside, something continued to grow, because while others heard music, he experienced it differently. For him, sound was not just something to be repeated, it was something to be shaped, something to be felt, something that connected directly to memory, to emotion, to the world around him. He could hear things others missed, the rhythm of footsteps, the tone of voices, the hidden tension in conversations, the fear, the anger, the control, and all of it, whether he intended it or not, found its way into his playing, blending together into something that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The plantation owners began to travel with him, taking him to other places, other rooms filled with people who had never seen anything like him. And each time the pattern repeated. Amazement at first, Then something quieter, something harder to describe, a feeling that stayed long after the music ended. One evening, in a large room filled with wealthy men, Thomas was asked to play something cheerful, something light, something that would entertain without discomfort. And he nodded slightly, his fingers finding the keys as they always did. And at first the music was exactly what they expected, bright, lively, easy to follow. But then slowly, almost without anyone noticing at first, the tone began to change, the notes deepened, the rhythm shifted. Something heavier entered the music, something that made the room feel smaller, tighter, and one by one, the men who had been smiling began to grow quiet, their expressions changing in ways they did not fully understand. The music did not stop, it continued, building, layering, pulling something from each listener, something personal, something hidden. And though no words were spoken, the tension in the room grew so strong that it felt almost physical, as if the air itself had thickened. When he finally stopped, the silence that followed was not the same as before. It was not calm, it was not relaxed, it was heavy. And for a moment no one spoke, no one moved, as if they were all waiting for something else to happen, something they could not name. Then the moment passed, voices returned, laughter forced its way back into the room, and the night continued as if nothing had happened. But the truth was, something had happened, something subtle but powerful, something that stayed with them even as they tried to ignore it. Back on the plantation, those who lived close to Thomas began to feel something similar. Though in quieter ways, they would hear him play in the distance, the sound carrying through the night, soft at times, sharp at others, and even without seeing him, they could feel the emotion in it, the weight of it. Some found comfort in it, a strange kind of understanding, as if the music was speaking what could not be said. But others felt uneasy, not because they believed it was harmful, but because it was too real, too honest, too close to something they could not escape. And as this pattern continued, as the music spread, as more people heard it and carried its memory with them, a question began to form, quietly, slowly, growing stronger with time, a question that no one dared to ask out loud. What if the boy was not just playing music? What if he was revealing something about them, something about the world they had built, something they could not control? And if that was true, what would happen if that music continued to grow stronger? At first the fear did not have a name. It moved quietly, like a shadow that no one wanted to admit was there, because to give it a name would mean accepting that something was wrong, something they could not control. And control was the one thing the plantation masters believed they would never lose, especially to a boy they considered nothing more than property. But fear does not need permission to grow. It finds its way into small moments, into thoughts that return late at night, into the silence after something unsettling has passed. And for those who had listened closely to Thomas, that fear began to take shape, not as something loud or obvious, but as a quiet unease that refused to leave. There were whispers now, more than before, no longer just comments about how strange his music felt, but questions about why it affected people the way it did, why some listeners walked away shaken, why others avoided his performances after hearing him once, and why a few could not stop thinking about it long after it ended. The plantation owners began to notice these reactions, not because they cared about the feelings of others, but because anything that threatened their reputation or their sense of control became a problem, and what had once been a source of pride, a boy with rare talent, was slowly becoming something else, something uncertain. One evening, after a performance that left the room unusually quiet, one of the men who had been listening stood up too quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his face pale, his breathing uneven, and though he tried to laugh it off, tried to make it seem like nothing, the others noticed, because they had felt it too, something in the music that had gone deeper than expected. Thomas remained seated at the piano, his head slightly tilted, his expression calm, as if nothing unusual had happened, but those who looked closely began to wonder if he understood more than he showed, if he was aware of the effect he had, or if it was something beyond even his control. As days passed, the reactions became harder to ignore. Some listeners reported feeling restless after hearing him, unable to sleep, their thoughts filled with fragments of melodies that would not fade. Others described a strange heaviness, as if the music had stirred something they had buried deep inside. Still, no one spoke openly about it, because to do so would invite questions they were not ready to answer. Questions about power, about control, about the possibility that something they believed was beneath them could affect them in ways they could not predict. On the plantation, the atmosphere began to shift, subtle but real. The workers moved with the same routine, the same silence, but there was something different in the way they listened when Thomas played, a deeper attention, a quiet understanding that his music carried something more than sound. Some found strength in it, a feeling they could not explain but could recognize, as if the music spoke to their pain, their memories, their unspoken thoughts, while others felt a kind of tension, not fear exactly but awareness, as if something important was happening beneath the surface. The masters, however, began to see things differently. What once brought them pride now brought them discomfort, not because the music had changed completely, but because their understanding of it had begun to shift, and with that shift came doubt. They started to question him, not directly at first, but through observation, watching him more closely, listening more carefully, trying to find something they could point to, something that would explain what they were feeling, but the more they watched, the less they understood. Thomas did not behave like someone trying to cause harm. He did not speak with defiance. He did not show anger in the way they expected. And yet the effect remained, growing slowly, steadily, impossible to deny. One afternoon, a man who had heard Thomas play several times refused to attend another performance, his refusal quiet but firm, and when asked why, he simply said that the music stayed with him too long, that it made him think in ways he did not like, and though he could not explain it further, his words carried weight. That was the moment things began to change more clearly, because now the concern was no longer hidden. It had been spoken, even if only in a small way, and once something is spoken, it becomes harder to ignore. The plantation owners could not accept the idea that something they controlled could influence them or others in such a way. It went against everything they believed about power, about hierarchy, about their place in the world, and so they began to look for answers, not in understanding, but in control. They adjusted his performances, choosing what he should play, when he should play, how long he should play, believing that structure would limit whatever effect his music had. But they did not realize that what made his music powerful was not just the notes, it was the feeling behind them, and that feeling could not be easily controlled. Thomas continued to play, as he always had, his fingers moving with the same natural ease, his mind shaping sound into something layered and complex. But now there was a difference, not in his ability, but in the way people listened. They listened with caution, with awareness, with a quiet fear they did not want to admit. And that fear changed everything. Because once fear enters a space, it alters how everything is seen, how everything is understood. The room no longer felt the same during his performances. It was no longer just a place of entertainment. It had become something else, something uncertain, something that held both fascination and discomfort. And the more that feeling grew, the harder it became to return to what it once was. Thomas, still quiet, still focused, continued to exist within this shifting world, a world where his gift was both admired and feared, where his presence brought both attention and unease, and though he did not speak about it, something inside him seemed to understand that things were changing. The question was no longer whether his music had an effect. That was clear now. The question was what that effect truly meant, and whether it would remain something people could ignore or become something they would try to stop. And as that question grew, as tension built slowly around him, one thing became certain. This was no longer just a story about talent, it was becoming something else entirely, something deeper, something that was moving toward a moment where everything would have to be faced. The change did not happen all at once, it came slowly, like a quiet decision forming in the minds of men who believed they were always in control, men who had spent their lives shaping the world around them to fit their will, and now found themselves facing something they could not fully understand, something that did not respond to force in the way they expected. At first they tried to make small adjustments, limiting when Thomas would play, choosing only certain audiences, avoiding situations where reactions had been strongest, telling themselves that the problem was not the boy, but the setting, the mood, the people, anything that allowed them to avoid the possibility that the source of their discomfort was something deeper. But the pattern continued no matter where he played, no matter who listened, there was always that moment, that shift in the air, that quiet tension that followed the music. And the more they tried to control it, the more it seemed to slip beyond their reach, like something that could not be contained by simple rules. One evening, after a performance that ended in the same heavy silence that had now become familiar, a discussion took place behind closed doors, voices low, careful, measured, because even among themselves they were cautious, not wanting to admit too much, not wanting to give shape to a fear that could challenge everything they believed. They spoke of profit, of reputation, of risk, but beneath those words was something else, something unspoken, a question that none of them wanted to ask directly. What if this boy, this enslaved child they believed they owned, was affecting them in a way that could not be explained or controlled, and what if that effect grew stronger? The idea was unsettling, not because it suggested harm in a physical sense, but because it hinted at something far more dangerous to them, a loss of certainty, a crack in the belief that they were above all things, beyond influence, beyond reach. So they made a decision, not a loud one, not one announced openly, but a quiet agreement to watch him more closely, to study his behavior, to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening, something they could point to, something they could control. Thomas, unaware of their discussions, or perhaps aware in a way that could not be easily understood, continued as he always had, moving through his days in silence, his world shaped by sound, by memory, by patterns that others could not see. And when he sat at the piano, nothing about his movement suggested fear or defiance. But those watching him now saw everything differently. Every pause, every shift in rhythm, every change in tone was examined, questioned, measured, as if somewhere within those details lay the answer they were searching for. One afternoon something happened that pushed their concern further than before. During a small performance, one of the men listening suddenly stood up, his face tense, his eyes unfocused, and without saying a word, he left the room, his steps quick, uneven, as if he needed to escape something he could not see. The others tried to dismiss it, to continue as if nothing had happened, but the moment lingered, heavy and undeniable. And when the music stopped, no one spoke for several seconds, the silence stretching longer than it should have, filled with a shared awareness that something was not right. After that day, the tone changed, not just among the masters, but across the entire plantation, because news travels in ways that cannot be stopped, carried through glances, through quiet conversations, through the simple act of noticing that something is different. Some began to believe that Thomas's music carried something inside it, not in a supernatural way, but in a way that touched the mind, that stirred thoughts and feelings that people were not prepared to face and form. Those who had spent their lives avoiding certain truths, that effect felt dangerous. The masters, unable to fully understand this, began to consider stronger actions, not out of clear reasoning, but out of a growing need to regain control, to remind themselves that nothing on their land existed beyond their authority. They debated limiting his performances even further, perhaps stopping them altogether, but that came with its own problem, because Thomas had become valuable. His talent brought attention, brought money, brought a kind of status they were not willing to give up easily. So they faced a conflict, keep him visible and risk whatever effect his music had, or silence him and lose what he represented, and in that conflict their uncertainty grew. Thomas continued to play, but now there was a difference, not in the music itself, but in the atmosphere around it. The listeners no longer came with simple curiosity or excitement. They came with caution, with expectation, with a quiet tension that shaped the way they heard every note. And the music responded, not consciously but naturally, because the energy of a room, the emotions of those present, all of it fed into what he created, making each performance feel heavier, more intense, more layered than before. There were moments now where the music felt almost overwhelming, where the rise and fall of sound seemed to mirror something deeper, something emotional, something that could not be easily ignored, and those moments left a mark on everyone who experienced them. Even after the last note faded, the feeling remained, lingering in the mind, returning in quiet moments, in the stillness of night, in the space between thoughts, and the more it returned, the harder it became to dismiss. The masters began to realize that this was no longer something they could simply manage with rules or observation. Whatever was happening was rooted in something deeper, something that did not respond to control in the way they were used to. And that realization brought them closer to a decision, a stronger action, something that would either restore their sense of power or reveal just how little control they truly had. Because when people who are used to absolute control begin to feel uncertainty, they do not remain still for long. They act sometimes without fully understanding the consequences. And as that moment approached, as tension built quietly but steadily, one thing became clear. The story of Thomas was no longer just about talent or even about fear. It was about power, about influence, about the possibility that something as simple as sound could challenge a system built on control. The question now was not whether they would act, but how far they were willing to go to stop something they could not fully understand. The decision, when it finally came, was not spoken loudly, it was not written down, it did not need to be, because it existed in the shared understanding of men who believed they had reached the limit of what they could tolerate, and that understanding carried one clear idea. Something had to change, and it had to change soon. They began by reducing his performances even further, limiting who could hear him, choosing only those they trusted, believing that by controlling the audience, they could control the outcome. But what they did not realize was that the effect of the music was not tied to the number of people in the room. It was tied to something deeper, something that could not be measured or predicted. Thomas noticed the change, not in words, not in direct instruction, but in the pattern of his days: fewer gatherings, fewer moments at the piano in front of others, more time in silence, more time alone. And though he did not question it openly, something inside him understood that the world around him was shifting. The plantation itself felt different now, quieter in a way that was not peaceful but tense, as if something was waiting, something unspoken moving beneath the surface. And even those who had once listened with curiosity now carried a sense of caution, unsure of what they would feel if they heard him play again. But silence did not solve the problem, because the memory of the music remained, and in some ways it grew stronger in its absence, returning in fragments, in echoes, in thoughts that appeared without warning, reminding those who had heard it that whatever they had experienced had not simply disappeared. This only made the masters more uneasy, because now the influence of the music seemed to exist even without sound, as if it had left something behind, something that could not be removed by simply stopping the performances. And that realization brought them to a more serious conclusion. If limiting him was not enough, then perhaps they needed to change something more fundamental. Something about the way he played, the way he expressed whatever it was that created such reactions. But how do you control something you do not understand? How do you shape something that comes naturally to someone else? They tried to guide him, to instruct him on what to play, choosing pieces that were known, familiar, structured, believing that if he followed a set pattern, The unpredictable nature of his music would disappear, but Thomas did not play like others. Even when repeating something he had heard, he added something of his own, something subtle but present. And it was in those small changes, those slight differences, that the same feeling returned, that same tension, that same quiet discomfort that settled into the room, reminding them that the problem had not been solved, only delayed. One evening, they decided to test something, a controlled performance, a small group, a familiar setting, nothing unexpected, and Thomas was asked to play only what he was told, nothing more, nothing less, and as he began, the music followed the expected path, simple, clear, predictable. For a moment it seemed to work. The listeners remained calm, their expressions relaxed, their posture easy, and the masters felt a sense of relief, believing that they had finally found a way to manage what had troubled them for so long. But then, slowly, almost unnoticed at first, something shifted, a slight change in rhythm, a deeper tone, a subtle layering of sound that was not part of the original piece. And though it was small, it was enough to bring back that feeling, that quiet tension that had never truly left. The room changed again, not suddenly but steadily, the ease fading, replaced by something more focused, more aware, and the listeners, though they tried to ignore it, could feel the difference, could sense that the music had moved beyond the boundaries they had tried to set. When the performance ended, no one spoke immediately, the silence returning once again, familiar now, heavy, filled with thoughts no one wanted to share. And in that silence the masters understood something they had been trying to avoid. This was not something they could fully control. That realization was not just uncomfortable, it was threatening, because their entire world was built on the belief that everything around them could be controlled, shaped, owned, and now they were faced with something that challenged that belief in a quiet but undeniable way. Their response was not calm, not thoughtful. It was driven by a need to restore certainty, to remove the source of their discomfort, to prove to themselves that nothing on their land existed beyond their power. And so the idea began to form, not yet fully defined, but clear in its direction. If the music was the source of the problem, then perhaps the music itself needed to be stopped, not limited, not guided, but stopped completely. It was a serious thought, one that carried consequences beyond what they were ready to admit, because Thomas was not just a boy who played the piano. He was a symbol of something rare, something valuable, something that had brought them recognition. But fear has a way of changing priorities, of making people choose certainty over value, control over benefit. And as that fear grew, so did their willingness to consider actions they might once have avoided. Thomas, still unaware of the full extent of their thoughts, continued to live within this changing world, his connection to sound unchanged, his ability as strong as ever. But around him, the space for that ability was shrinking, closing in, shaped by decisions he did not make. And yet even in that tightening space, the essence of what he did could not be fully contained, because it did not exist only in the act of playing. It existed in memory, in experience, in the minds of those who had heard him. The masters could stop the performances. They could limit his access to the piano. They could attempt to silence the source, but they could not erase what had already been felt, what had already taken root in the thoughts of those who had listened. And that truth, whether they accepted it or not, meant that the story had already moved beyond their control. The question now was not whether they could stop him, but whether stopping him would change anything at all, or whether it would only reveal that what they feared was never something they could remove in the first place. Because some things once experienced do not fade, they remain, shaping thoughts, influencing perception, quietly changing the way the world is seen. And as the tension reached its highest point, as decisions edged closer to action, one thing became clear: whatever happened next would not simply end the story, it would define it. The final decision did not come with a single moment of agreement. It grew out of repeated fear, repeated discomfort, repeated failure to control something that should have been simple in their eyes. And over time, that quiet fear hardened into resolve. The kind of resolve that does not question itself, because questioning would mean admitting weakness. They chose to act, not in a loud or public way, but in a quiet, controlled manner, limiting Thomas even further, restricting his access to the piano, reducing the moments when he could express the one thing that made him different, believing that if they removed the source, they would remove the effect. At first it seemed to work. The plantation grew quieter. The strange tension that once followed his performances began to fade from daily life. The masters returned to their routines with a sense of relief, telling themselves that whatever had unsettled them was now behind them. That control had been restored. But something unexpected began to happen, not immediately, not in a way that could be clearly seen, but slowly, quietly. The absence of his music created a different kind of tension, one that did not come from sound but from silence, because what had once been expressed through music was now left unspoken, unresolved. The workers felt it first, the absence, the quiet that did not comfort, but pressed in, as if something important had been taken away, something that had given shape to feelings they could not express in words. And without it, those feelings remained heavier now, with no outlet. Even the masters began to notice a difference, though they would never describe it in the same way. The plantation felt still, but not peaceful, structured, but not stable, as if something had shifted beneath the surface and left a space that could not be easily filled. Thomas continued to exist within this silence, his world unchanged in one sense, still shaped by sound, still filled with patterns and memory, but now lacking the one place where all of it could come together. The piano that had once been both his voice and his connection to everything around him. He did not protest, he did not resist in ways they expected, but something about him changed, not visibly, not in a way that could be pointed out easily, but in a quieter way, in the way he listened, in the way he held himself, as if the silence itself had become something he was trying to understand. Days turned into weeks, and the absence of his music did not erase what had happened before. Instead, it seemed to make it more present, more noticeable in memory, because without new performances to focus on, the old ones returned clearer, sharper, more difficult to ignore. Some of the men who had once listened to him began to think about those moments again, not by choice, but because the memory came back on its own. The rise and fall of the notes, the shift in tone, the feeling that had settled into the room. And now, without the distraction of new experiences, those memories felt stronger. They began to realize something they had not considered before, that the effect of the music had never been limited to the moment it was played. It had always extended beyond that, into thought, into reflection, into the quiet spaces where people faced themselves. And that realization brought a new kind of discomfort, one that could not be solved by silence, because silence did not remove what had already been felt. It only left it without context, without resolution. The decision to silence Thomas had not removed the problem. It had changed its form, made it less visible, but no less present, and in some ways more difficult to deal with, because now there was nothing external to point to, nothing to blame. Thomas, in his own way, continued to process the world around him. The absence of music did not remove his connection to sound. He still heard everything, still remembered, still carried within him the same depth of perception. But now, that expression remained inside, unshared. There were moments, quiet ones, where he would move his fingers as if playing, tracing patterns in the air, not making sound but remembering it, and those who saw it felt something they could not explain, because even without music, the presence of it was still there. The masters began to understand that what they had tried to control was not just an action, not just the act of playing, but something deeper, something tied to perception, to awareness, to the way people experienced the world when exposed to something real. And that understanding, though incomplete, brought them to a final realization, one that they could not easily act upon because it offered no clear solution. They could not erase what had already been experienced. They could not control how people felt. They could not fully silence something that existed not just in sound, but in memory and thought. The story of Thomas was no longer something they could shape. It had moved beyond their reach, carried in the minds of those who had heard him. In the quiet changes that followed, in the awareness that something as simple as music could reveal truths they had spent their lives avoiding. And in that sense, even in silence, even without a single note being played, the influence remained, quiet but persistent, shaping the space around it in ways that could not be undone. Because true impact does not always come from force, it does not always announce itself loudly, sometimes it moves through feeling, through experience, through moments that stay long after they have passed. Thomas had never needed to raise his voice, never needed to act in the ways they feared, because what he carried, what he expressed, worked differently. It reached people in ways they could not defend against, in ways that made them aware of something deeper. And once that awareness exists, it cannot simply be removed. The plantation returned to its routine on the surface. The structure remained, the roles unchanged, the appearance of control intact, but beneath that surface something had shifted, something subtle but lasting, and that shift was the true story. In the end, there was no loud conclusion, no single moment that marked a clear finish. Because some stories do not end with action, they end with understanding, and understanding often comes quietly, slowly, in ways that are easy to overlook if one is not paying close attention. The plantation continued as it always had on the surface, the same routines, the same expectations, the same belief in control. But beneath that surface, something had changed, something that could not be seen directly, but could be felt in small ways. In the pauses between conversations, in the way people listened more carefully, in the way silence itself seemed to carry more meaning than before. Thomas remained where he was, his life still shaped by forces beyond his control, his freedom still denied. But the one thing that had made him different, the one thing that had unsettled those around him, had already done its work. It had revealed something that could not be easily forgotten or ignored. Those who had heard him, truly heard him, carried that experience with them, even if they tried not to, even if they told themselves it meant nothing, because deep down they knew it had meant something. It had shown them a part of themselves, a part of the world they had built that they were not prepared to face. Some dismissed it, choosing to return to their certainty, their comfort, their belief that nothing had changed, but others could not fully do that. They found themselves thinking differently, noticing things they had once ignored, feeling a quiet tension between what they believed and what they had experienced. And that tension, though subtle, was powerful, because it created space for doubt, for reflection, for the possibility that the world was not as simple or as controlled as they had always believed. And once that possibility exists, it does not easily disappear. Thomas never stood in front of them and spoke these ideas. He never challenged them in words. He never needed to, because what he expressed through his music had already done something deeper. It had reached beyond words, beyond argument, into feeling, into awareness. Even after his music was silenced, the effect remained, not as something dramatic or obvious, but as something quiet and persistent, shaping thoughts, influencing perception, existing in the background of their lives in ways they could not fully escape. Years would pass, and the memory of those moments would fade for some, but for others it would remain, not always clear, not always easy to describe, but present, like a distant echo that returns when the world grows quiet enough to hear it. And that is the part of the story that matters most. Not whether he was allowed to play, not whether the masters believed they had regained control, but the fact that for a brief time, something broke through, something reached them in a way they could not fully defend against. Because power is often seen as something physical, something enforced through strength or authority. But there is another kind of power, quieter, less visible, but just as real, the power to make people feel, to make them aware, to make them question. Thomas carried that power not by choice, not as a weapon, but as something natural to who he was, something that existed in the way he experienced the world and translated it into sound, something that connected with others, whether they wanted it to or not. And in that sense, even within a system designed to control every part of his life, there was something that could not be fully controlled, something that moved beyond ownership, beyond limitation, into the minds and emotions of those who encountered it. That is why his story remains important, not because of what people claimed about him, not because of fear or rumor, but because it reveals something deeper about human experience, about the ways in which truth can be felt, even when it is not spoken. So when you think about this story, do not just think about a boy at a piano, do not just think about talent or fear. Think about what it means for something so simple, so quiet, to carry such impact, to create change not through force, but through feeling. And ask yourself this: if something like that could exist in a place built on control, in a system designed to silence, what else might exist beneath the surface of history, waiting to be heard, waiting to be understood? Thank you for watching Story of the Black Past. If you stayed until this moment, I truly appreciate you. Tell me again where you watched from, your city, your country, and the time. And if you have not subscribed, take a moment to like and subscribe, because there are many more stories like this, stories that challenge what we think we know, stories that reveal what has been hidden. And remember, some stories are not loud, but they are powerful enough to change the way the world is seen, even long after the sound has faded.